Hello and welcome to our second episode of OpsCast, where I host guests from across the DevOps, reliability and MLOps communities, sharing what I hope is an easily digestible snapshot into current challenges and, really importantly, how these are being tackled. I'm your host, Tom Parker, and today I'm delighted to be joined by David Sandilands, Principal Solutions Architect over at Puppet, and also, I've got to say this, co-author of the very well-read and well-respected State of DevOps and Platform Engineering report. David, an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Would you be able to give our guests, our listeners and our viewers just a little intro to you?
Sure. Thanks for having us on, Tom. So as you said, I'm a Principal Solutions Architect at Puppet. The title's a little bit of a dodge to what I used to do at Puppet, because I was a solutions architect working with our kind of largest, most complex customers and kind of advising on, when they're kind of getting towards the edge of what our product capabilities and capacities are, advising sort of appropriate patterns as to how they can use the products well. Not just in terms of technology, but in terms of processes and how people work together. I'm kind of more technically a product manager these days. So I product manage Puppet's developer experience. And I also manage integrations with things like ServiceNow, Splunk, and other observability tools. And also I work on product management of the supported content the Puppet has on its Forge. So the modules that you can take and kind of have a defined support contract with Puppet. In the past, I was a Unix admin. It was very depressing when somebody described somebody as old school because they'd done Solaris and AIX, and I had to ask, did they do HPUX as well? So I worked in the financial sector for around 13 years. And that's where my background came into kind of coming into Puppet, because obviously highly regulated industry with huge interest in kind of state enforcement and so on.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And coming on to your work that you do out in the community, and a lot of people that will be listening into this will know of you in some shape or form. How did you get into working around the State of DevOps Platform Engineering reports?
Yeah, so because I kind of had a strong background in terms of my most recent work in NatWest, I worked on kind of developing their platform engineering setup. And when I came into Puppet and I was working for Nigel Kirsten, who was kind of a long-term author of the State of DevOps report, he kind of saw I had that background and experience in, particularly in platform engineering. So I kind of got involved on presenting the previous year's report, so the 2023 report, which was the first time the State of DevOps report kind of focused down onto platform engineering. And as we came into this year, myself and Margaret Lee, then became co-authors, having built that kind of experience. It's probably worth kind of highlighting, historically the State of DevOps report focused kind of widely on all of DevOps and was kind of a much wider set of questions. But we sort of found that the report was kind of getting into a kind of a static phase in the last few years. And, we kind of then wanted to zone into where we can see there are still some outliers, organizations who are more mature in DevOps, and, what is making them more mature. And platform engineering was one of those kind of strong things we saw.
Absolutely. And that will be the continuation this year in going down that route, kind of a more honed focus.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, this year's report kind of last year's report was that kind of initial look into platform engineering. And as we went into this year's report, we were kind of looking at, the maturity that's coming out. We're seeing, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, for example, released its kind of maturity model for platform engineering. And I think that's what we're kind of, what we saw in the report was in terms of the age of the platforms, there's actually not that many kind of very new platforms. They all seem, it seems to be a thing that's happened, with quite a lot of organizations at the same time. And we see, that kind of 3 to 5 years old range and then kind of older on top of that. So it's, seeing how it's maturing and how people make sure that, they're continuing to evolve the platforms and, keep themselves relevant.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you for the insight there. Lovely. We will jump into our questions for the day. As with the OpsCast, what we're trying to do each week is keep these relatively uniform to provide some insight into what you're getting up to and where you see those challenges. So the first question that I'll ask you today is, what's the most interesting challenge that you're currently facing?
Yeah, I think the most interesting challenge is there's a sort of maturity thing across the the industry. It's kind of interesting. I talked about working on that platform team for NatWest, and we kind of got this presentation that that we expected things to almost graduate. So we had our traditional workload, and that would kind of go into IaaS, and then things would then go into CAS and containers, and then things would go into PaaS, and everything was to be cloud first. And I think everyone expected, so naturally everything would just happily flow up into PaaS and be out in the public cloud. And of course, with all things wanting a uniform change, that didn't happen. And what we actually see is that even though there's obviously big growth in things like Kubernetes, things like virtual machines, which I think a lot of people thought would just go away, essentially are still growing 3-4% a year or something. So that's kind of become a huge challenge, for everyone, and for people like us in terms of our configuration management and things like Puppet. That's where it becomes more interesting, because historically, you have that huge focus on, hey, we want to kind of define our setup and we want to bring in new modules, and we're building something new, and after many years, it then moves into, hey, we've got this huge code base. It does very important things, but we have a turnover of staff. We kind of invest our kind of top money into things like Kubernetes and so on, and we need to do this maintenance here, but in a way we don't want to kind of spend too much money on it, because ultimately we're trying to maintain this thing. It doesn't feel like we should have to spend a lot of money on it. And people often kind of inherit these code bases, and then they have to kind of work out, how do they get around to understanding it? How do they make sure they're doing the right maintenance in terms of, if they've taken things from our public forge, how do they make sure they're keeping up to date with that? And all these questions are now coming out around open source. I think a few years ago you were happily able just to go out and say, don't worry, I'm going to take this open source thing and just stick it in our code base. And now there's huge questions of, well, are you sure about the licensing? Are you sure about the source? How are you maintaining it? Who supports it? And all these sorts of questions. So it's kind of this huge maturity and maintenance question. And I think that's where organizations like ourselves are now kind of focusing on, well, how do we make that easier? And how do we kind of, take away that toil in terms of, when you look at things like GitHub with Dependabot, you want that kind of thing that comes in and says, hey, you need to update this thing. And, and I've tried to help you as far as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And is that a generalization across what you're seeing in the community as a whole, where teams have kind of gone through these transitions now? A lot of that new tech has come in, as you said, that have built up some pretty big estates there. And now it is kind of in management mode in how to keep this running and keep the lights on within those new estates. And as you say, incrementally kind of move them forward.
Yeah, I think that is definitely an industry thing, and I think what's interesting is the scale. Because like I've still got somewhere down here a little folder for Royal Academy when I was a graduate in 2005, and it, it's very twee because it talks about the massive Unix estate they have of 200 servers, and when we're looking at customers now, a financial organization of the size I was a graduate for has between 20,000 and over 100,000 Linux nodes managed under Puppet, or obviously equivalent tools. And I think that's the huge challenge, is that the team sizes haven't got any bigger, and they've got a lot more kind of areas to focus on, because in the good old days, you had a couple of data centers and you had a very small selection of hardware and small selection of uses, whereas now you ultimately you have multiple public clouds, you have internal clouds, you obviously people want to reduce the amount of technology they're using, and as we kind of mentioned about platforms, they have tried to use platforms to help that self-service, but it's almost inevitable in terms of the modern day approach is that you need multiple platforms and multiple technologies to kind of make these things work. So it's that whole balancing act.
Absolutely. And with the market, sadly, as it has been over the last probably 18 months or so, actually, we may have even seen reduction in team resource managing these estates as well.
No, definitely. I think, everyone's been under a lot of financial pressure. And I think, vendors and, customers alike. And I think that's where, everyone has to kind of make sure that value's there, and make sure that, we're continuing to move along, because I feel like DevOps has had that kind of almost identity crisis in terms of, there was this kind of rapid progress, initially, and it's certainly something I can feel from my career. But we've kind of gone through this awkward phase where we've thrown out a lot of new technology, and done some things very, very rapidly, and then had to kind of go, well, have we actually done the right thing? And we are ultimately seeing some things come off the public cloud, some things come off Kubernetes, and I'm not expecting a kind of total reversal there, but I think it's just kind of people now really trying to rationalize, well, where does this thing work best, and where can I have the kind of optimal, cost to kind of benefit ratios, particularly with things like public cloud getting more expensive in places.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing in areas such as, I know the buzzword there, but AI, ML, where you're driving more through those platforms. In fact, the costs involved in some of that are pretty crazy. So it's all that thinking about what do we actually need here, and maybe a reduction in certain places.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting kind of from a vendor point of view, because I think historically you had much more of a capability for people to kind of get venture capital money or whatever, and kind of have, here's a bag of cash, don't worry about making money, just go away and develop something that's fashionable and come back to us. And I don't think realistically anyone has that kind of luxury now. I think with the the removal of low interest rates and the current economic climate, people having to work much smarter and having to kind of be much more work out how they can do things in small steps and iterate over them. And obviously things like AI and new technology has to come in, and it requires an investment. But I think it's having to be much smarter and work out how to integrate it well and how to deliver it in bits, so that you're not saying, hey, we're not going to make money for 2 years, but don't worry, we'll have money thrown at us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what we're seeing out there. Fantastic. There's going to be a huge amount of lessons that you can take away from that conversation there. But is there something out of that you would share with the community as a learning point or lesson?
Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson is, I mean, it's always very difficult, because I think when you're starting out into these new technologies, it's often kind of this race to success. And I think one of the key things, if I kind of lean into how I saw the most successful platforms formed, is a lot of organizations get very tempted to bring in consultants and contractors and people who are experts in that bleeding edge technology, and kind of let them go and say, we got these objectives, go and deliver us these new shiny things. But what I kind of saw in the more successful platforms was that they took their own staff, their own current staff, and looked for the people who are looking for those opportunities to learn, and kind of combined them with those consultants and contractors. So it balanced the kind of view that was coming through in terms of, that's great, but how's it going to work with our audit and change management process? How are we going to support this kind of from a recovery point of view? And, all these kind of important questions are, always there, but, often kind of get missed in that initial rush to kind of, that fear of missing out. So, to me, that's the key lesson, is that, you can't just buy people in, it's got to be your own staff you're bringing up to these things. And, creating those partnerships early on, it might take a bit longer.
Yeah.
But I think people's fear about being left behind is always exaggerated, because getting it right first time is so much more valuable than getting out there first and having to do it multiple times.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Thank you. And this question crosses over, and I think you're a really nice person to be asking this because you've seen different environments, so the vendor side, internally, different industries. Is there a piece of advice that you feel would add value to other ops teams that are either going on the journey or tackling similar challenges to what you've seen and faced?
Yeah, I mean, I think my general advice for ops teams is, from my own experience and background, is that often we get very obsessed with the technology, right? Because we're in IT, the tech's cool, the tech's fun, but it's not to kind of lose sight of the kind of processes and people, and when you see things like team topologies and all these approaches that talk about the interactions, because there's been so many times when particularly when I'm talking about my solutions architects role, where we've come into teams and they're really focused on how do I make this technology work, and I'm kind of like, well, let's not make the technology work. What are you trying to do? And you get up a whiteboard and you kind of draw out the steps and the people and the processes and the gatekeeping and so on. And more often than not, you can hear people go, "Why the hell do we do that?" And it's that kind of realizing the technology is just an enabler. And it's your own processes and your own people and your own teams that kind of really matter to make it work. And it's there's often this thing being done in DevOps with this obsession with the fangs, right? And kind of saying, "Oh, we need to be more like Google, or we need to be more like this," and it's kind of thing of, well, no, you're a government or you're a bank. You don't need to be more like Google because they're completely different. You need to do what you do well and take that further. And it's amazing how many organizations I speak to who feel really bad about themselves and the way they do things. And I'm like, it's not that bad. It's just, you could do better. And it's just, having that kind of continuous improvement and review of, how teams are working with each other. And even just making sure they're having the right discussions, because change management, being from a banking background, change management is all that classic one. And it's amazing how many teams can say, we can't do it because of change management. And you say, well, who have you spoken to? And they go, oh, no, but it just wouldn't happen. Like, why don't we talk to someone? And when you have that meeting and you try to say, well, what is change management's motivation for doing this? And you talk through your motivation, it's that thing of just teams coming together and actually describing what their motivations are, and then working out, okay, well, here's that kind of middle ground, and here's how we can kind of meet what everyone's trying to do. And and that obviously goes right up to kind of CEOs and CTOs in terms of understanding what are the motivations of our senior leaders, as well as our local teams, and making sure that we can represent all that and say at the end, hey, we implemented this thing, here's why we did it, and here's what it delivers. And then everyone kind of wins and make sure that we're not in that position we're talking about where people are going, oh, well, money's very tight, and ultimately you're not on the core strategic delivery.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting you say that. We had Alex Glenn over at Domino Data on the show last week, and I initially set these questions up as kind of technically focused, and where it comes back to, it's all that communication, the interaction piece, very similar kind of thoughts and feedback from him as well. Have you, in general, seen improvements in that communication piece between ops teams, engineering teams, the wider business, upper hierarchy?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think things like in terms of that kind of product focus that we taught from platform engineering, things like that really help that kind of approach. I think it can be that thing of things become the new normal, right? So people kind of forget what things were like. Going back 10 years, it's night and day. I wouldn't believe myself if I said how modern financial institutions work these days.
Yeah.
It's just the difficulty is because everything becomes so much more, and it's that classic thing. People always assume that when they make improvements, it's about saving money, whereas in reality, it's often just about building more capability. There was quite an interesting story in about one of the chaps who worked for kind of IBM during the kind of NASA, the main NASA years. He was talking about when he wanted to kind of get an upgrade from punch cards to terminals, and he hadn't actually thought out what he was really asking for, he said. So he kind of, he went and said, right, IBM needs to move from punch cards to terminals so we can input this easier, and, it's just going to be better, So the guy, so NASA's like, okay, well, how much do we save? And he kind of awkwardly goes, oh, and he looks at his engineer, and his engineer goes, 20%. And he goes, great, so you have 20% less staff. Right. And, that wasn't the intention at all. It was kind of but he hadn't thought through that question of capability. And ultimately the engineer just the kind of punchline of that book was he could have turned to him and said, where do you get 20% from? He's like, I don't know, I just had to give you a number, didn't I?
That's something there.
So, and I think that's that kind of common mistake, is that you want to be talking about building out those capabilities.
Absolutely. That leads really nicely actually onto the next question. In some of those mistakes and pitfalls, are there any projects that you personally would view as a failure or hadn't achieved the outcomes that you'd like them to, and what did you take away from those?
Yeah, I mean, I really focus on one project for me. It goes back quite a number of years, it really sunk in platform engineering for me, because I was working at BSkyB, and they had this setup. It shows how long ago it was. It was sort of just as Puppet and configuration management was becoming popular.
Yeah.
But internally, we had this system it was based on shell scripts. It was called building block scripts, and it was kind of a configuration management thing built in-house. And it was very advanced for its time, because it was able to kind of do provisioning in VMware, and the shell scripts were able to then build things up so that essentially you could just run one thing and it would have WebSphere built and ready to go, or Oracle built and ready to go. And it was very advanced for its time. And we got into this odd marketing problem where another group in the organization came along and said, hey, you don't have a capability of doing provisioning and configuration, so we want to build this new stack. And they got it all approved and they got the money, and then they suddenly showed up and were like, we're building this new thing. And we were in this awkward position of going like, well, no, we don't think we shouldn't move this, but we've got this thing that works.
Yeah. And
we got into this terrible position where we felt like we were doing the right thing in terms of pointing out how wrong they were. Because they were kind of saying things like, hey, nobody uses your tool, and hey, there's no development, and I was showing all the proof that they were wrong, but I sort of completely missed the point, because we didn't have the relationships with the developers. We didn't have the relationships with the senior leadership and decision makers. We were kind of in this weird place where almost nobody was aware we did the thing. Nobody was aware of how successful it was. Nobody was aware of how we could develop it and change it and make it better, and potentially introduce some of these technologies. So we kind of ended up getting backed into a corner, and ultimately they implemented the new system because they committed to it. And it had this disastrous result of you had two systems running, and they were trying to introduce too much at one time. And all the kind of problems of trying to bring in a whole new system all at once. And it kind of haunted me in that sense of, it definitely could have been done very differently. And I think, us not owning those relationships with those key contacts so that developers could tell us what they were needing, so that we were representing to leadership of, hey, we're doing this important thing. What do you want us to do next, and how do we do that? And that's a huge part of actually this year's State of DevOps report, talking about the product manager role and how they do that translation with the business and other teams, to make sure that communication's there, and make sure it's all kind of keeping relevant and continuing to evolve, and people have the confidence in you, because otherwise you have these excellent technical solutions, but nobody knows about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it, as I said, it kind of leads back into some of the conversation we've been having, all of that communication piece and interaction, and ensuring there's buy-in across the groups that you're working with. Fantastic. That's really useful. Thank you. And a little bit of fun to finish off with. You don't have to take this too seriously, but your most loved tech Might be a tricky one to answer, given your have some tech very close to home to you, I'm sure, and your most loathed tech.
I'll go with a personal one and an industry one. So the personal one is I have a Freestyle Libre on my arm because I'm diabetic. So it feels like this unknown technology to most people who aren't diabetics, but when I was first diagnosed as diabetic kind of 15 years ago, you basically, to tell what your blood sugar level is, to understand, have you too much sugar in your body or too little, you had to kind of take a prick, stab your finger and put, pour blood onto a little strip, and it took 10 seconds to come back, and you got a kind of point in time. If it was too cold, it didn't work. If it was too hot, it didn't work. You couldn't do it in the rain. There's all these problems.
Yeah.
And then this kind of magic device came out, and it runs every 2 weeks. And the difference is it basically puts a little bit of plastic that kind of goes underneath the skin, and it can read the blood level just under the skin. The most modern version now just sends a continuous feed to my phone, and that way, instead of just like a point in time, I essentially just have a continuous feed of what my blood sugar level is, and I can see a kind of graph of up and down, and it then gives you kind of predictive patterns. So in terms of that kind of health benefit, it's kind of revolutionary, because when I'm hill walking and out in the cold, it's just sending it to my phone. I don't have to worry about it being too cold.
Yeah.
If I'm driving or something, I can quickly pull over and check and see it's all immediately fine. And obviously with the kids, it's that thing of kids are not famously patient for waiting for somebody to just take 10 seconds to quickly put blood onto a tiny strip. So that's my favorite personal technology.
It's a good one.
In terms of industry, I obviously the puppet guy is going to say config management, but it is there for me because when I first started at NatWest, or Royal Bank of Scotland it was at the time, as a Unix admin, it was really hard. People built boxes by hand, and it was kind of revolutionary when you see how it went from just this acceptance that things took forever, and there was a whole data center of testing kit that people just hung on to because they had this fear of God of like, well, if I let go of this bit of testing kit, how the heck will I get a new one?
Yeah.
And it seems very foreign to people now in that assumption of like being hard to get a VM or being hard to get the correct hardware. But it really was. It took people months to build something to get it right, and then to get to production you had these awkward kind of things of a Unix guy would build it and pass it on to an application team, and then it'd come back for review and they'd say, oh no, you've changed something and broken our Unix standard. And there was that old joke with audit of does this comply with PCI? Well, it did when it was built. And when we get to the scale we are now, it's kind of, as I said, you get to new normals and you get to accepted standards, but from that background, it is just still that thing to me, which is it was such a huge change, and it's kind of beyond kind of seeing like physicals go to virtuals. It's kind of hard to think of another change that was kind of so big in terms of the scale and capability it allowed.
Absolutely, and what it allowed teams to do, and where that led to.
Yeah, and it took so much toil off people in terms of just silly things they had to do. And I always think of that kind of quote about the really good toil you remove is when you remove toil and people get family time back, right? They don't have to do all this extra time, and they're not kind of having to go home late and having to do out of hours to cover things. And that's something config management really, really delivered on.
Absolutely. And most loathed tech.
Again, I'll do a personal one. HP printers. I had an interesting experience where the blurry thing out here, I have a Brother printer that you can see behind me, but I had a HP printer and it ran out of ink, so I duly went to change its ink, and I had genuine HP cartridges, but apparently they were too old. Because HP had updated the firmware and was now doing these weird security checks. So I was told the compatible cartridges I had were not valid. So I got a Brother printer, and all I can tell you is Brother printers were very close second in most loved technology, because it's completely changed my view on printing. But that sort of behaviour in general, in terms of, you know, changing conditions and trying to kind of squeeze money out and trying to do those sort of silly things where it's like the people you're trying to squeeze money out of were never going to give you that money, and in reality you're only hurting people who were just trying to get along.
Absolutely. Well, interesting story. My dad, in his older years, decided to take up photography professionally, and had exactly the same, even from a professional level, on the printer he uses, and went through quite a lot of ink through it, and has having the same moans and groans about it. And as you said, it's less about you having to change it. It's more kind of the why question. It's just there to drive more revenue.
And I guess on the sort of industry side, it'll sound like the puppet guy saying it, but, you know, I think the overuse of what I'll say is simple things like YAML. I think we've kind of really hurt ourselves as an industry in terms of we had complexity in how we were configuring things in terms of using language like Puppet or Chef or you know, or whatever. And I feel like we went too far with trying to use very simple things like YAML, and we tried to describe things which are complex and, you know, need more detail. And because, you know, throwing things out like YAML was quick, we've kind of allowed ourselves to scatter a lot of stuff out there, and then suddenly, you know, as we talked about earlier, having that maturity problem of, oh God, now we've got all this stuff out there which is, you know, simple, but it's really not simple. You know, there's a lot of it, and trying to find a way to manage that is, you know, becomes a lot more difficult because you've limited how you can describe it and how you can use it.
So actually spending more time going back through what you thought was a quick fix initially to get to the right place.
Yeah,
absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you so much. That, I'm sure, for people that are listening in and viewing, and there'll be a huge amount of takeaways from that, obviously with your background and the breadth that you've seen out there as well, so it's hugely appreciated. Any questions, any comments, anything that our viewers and listeners would like to ask, please chuck them in the comments below and I'll pick them up. I can pass them on to David as well. If there's anything there that I can't answer for you, we hope to see you next time around for the third episode, which will be live a week or two after this episode, and we will see you there. Thank you very much and goodbye.